Hopefully this picks up my mic. It seems like it's saying the right things, but anyway. Okay, so we've done read. We've done this is the wrong way, isn't it? Crud and then C curd. We've done reading. So we learned about HTTP methods in the node module. And fetch by default makes a GET request. But as we know, there are other types of requests we can make. So far we have made a GET request to read data from a server. We're going to use an API that follows RESTful conventions, representational state transfer. It's a bit of a silly term. It's just a set of rules that APIs can follow, and it's based around URLs and HTTP verbs. So with a combination of these two URLs and all of these verbs, we can do a whole load of different actions with the data on the server. And this is all stuff you kind of did with Express. Your servers were probably REST-based APIs. So if we want to get all the books, we make a GET request to just /books, pretty much like we've just done here. We've just done recipe puppies just /API. So it could. This is an API that specifies what's the word I want? I don't know. That deals with just recipes. So it's a bit unnecessary to have recipe puppy /API /recipes because there's nothing else. So you can kind of, where are we? You can, if you have, I don't know, books.com /API, there's no real point having books here if everything is to do with books. But generally, you're going to have the name of the thing that you want to get access to. Then if we want only one of them, we pass it an ID, some sort of unique identifier, usually an ID. If we want to create a book, we make a post request to /books. If we want to update a book, we make a patch request. If we replace all of the contents of a book, we use put. Generally, I don't use put, but some APIs will use it. And if we want to delete a book, we can make a delete request. So these are RESTful rules. If an API says it is a RESTful API, then you can already know exactly how to use it. You will make a request to /things to get all of the things and so on. So these are the rules of RESTful APIs. Was that someone unmuting? I don't know. So JSON server. I can't remember if I've shown you JSON server. I may have done. So you just spent several weeks learning how to build essentially RESTful APIs using Node and Express and all of this fancy stuff. Now, JSON server does all of that for you with just the JSON file, and we're going to do that. So I'm going to install JSON server. We're going to recipes.json. We're going to have an array of recipes with an ID of 1. It's going to be an object, ID of 1, title or length, and hang on, that's what I'm having for my tea. Then I don't know, thumbnail so on. So eventually, once my internet allows me to install JSON server, I might already have it installed actually. I'm just gonna JSON server. Nope. Okay, so while that's installing, JSON server takes a JSON file and creates a really good, actually, a completely fully fledged with searching and filtering and all sorts included, a full REST API based off the contents of a JSON file, and it will write to the JSON file. We sort of did this in one of the early Node lessons. We built a very basic kind of bad API that was just updating files and text files and possibly a JSON file, I can't remember. And then we talked about how it's kind of neat, but it's not a great. It's not used. You shouldn't use it for production. So same with JSON server. It's really good for prototyping and kind of practicing this sort of stuff. But you shouldn't really. It doesn't replace your full database Express app with your Firebase and all of that stuff. But it's pretty nice, and this is taking so long to install. Don't understand what's happening. Okay, so to make a GET request, we just say fetch and then pass the URL, in this case just /books. If we want to change anything about the request that we make, there is a second argument that we can pass to fetch, which is an object of options. One option is to specify that we want to be making a request using a different type of method. So HTTP method, HTTP verb, these are all sort of interchangeable. Fetch uses the term method. So if you want to make a post request, you have to pass this second argument to fetch after the URL, and then your browser will make a post request instead of a GET request. Usually, now not always, it kind of depends on the server, but usually you also need two other options in this options object. So if you're posting something, you are sending data to a server. So you're going to need a body. You're going to need some kind of data that you are actually sending. We touched on this a little bit during the Node module. For a server to accept the data that you're sending you need to include headers that kind of describe the data that you're sending. So when you are sending stuff as a sort of security measure, a server first looks at the headers and says, where's this request coming from, what type of request is it, and what type of data are you sending? And if all of those things are kind of valid, only then will it look into the body of the request and actually process the data that you're sending. So we need to send some headers. The headers that we send are sort of weird and the same, and you don't always need them, and you might only need one or the other. But generally, if you are posting data, you need to specify the type of the data that you're sending, and you are kind of requesting that the server accepts that type of data. It's a bit weird that you include both of them. Like I said, not every server requires you to include both of them, but it's just good practice to remember content type and accept. Now, the actual type is what's known as a MIME type. And that's not one of those creepy people who pretend they're stuck in a box. A media type, multi-purpose internet something something, multi-mail extensions, weird. So this is the sort of syntax for a MIME type. We have the main type, and then the subtype, I suppose. So application is the one that we'll be using, but you can have audio, you can have image, you can have all sorts, and we're going to be using, what are we going to be using? Application/JSON. So we are saying we're sending some JSON data to the server, please accept some JSON data. It's a little bit confusing that you need to include both, but luckily the value for both of those keys is the same. So application JSON, that is the MIME type of JSON data. So now we have our fetch to books. We have the options where we're specifying it's a post request. We specify that it's JSON, and then we have our body. And notice that I've got single quotes here and here. This is a string. So we can only send strings in our body. We can't send a book object like that. We can't send a sort of a brand new book object like that. We have to send a string. So quite often you're going to have some sort of book object and you call JSON stringify. So JSON stringify takes a JavaScript object and converts it into one string that represents that data in JSON. Do we have? Great, we do. So now I've gone to localhost 3000 recipes, and we have a JSON API that is serving this array of recipes. There's only one right now, but if I go to recipes/1, I get just that one recipe. If I go to recipes question mark, this is the query params, Q equals polenta, something like that. Rice. Okay, yeah, so Q is often in RESTful APIs. Q is often short for kind of search query. And there's a whole bunch of other options we could use. These are all built into JSON server. They aren't necessarily standard, but JSON server is really good for practicing with APIs. So we have this new recipes endpoint. So now, canary property for each. That's because data from the server is actually just recipes now. We just get the array rather than an object with an array of results. We just get an array of all the recipes in our backend. As soon as I update this, rice and ham. Oh yeah, great. I'm going to need to restart that, but maybe it will be okay. But if we say watch, then it automatically updates it. Oh, it's still quite slow. It's faster, but it's still quite slow. Anyway, I've updated this file, and if we were to have that installed and running and reload the page, we would see both of these here. So JSON server isn't really anything that you kind of should be using in your careers, unless maybe you just want to throw together a prototype to demonstrate something for a client or whatever. But it's really good. Sometimes people do get a bit confused with, oh, should we be using JSON server from now on, and confused with kind of what's JSON server and what's just standard fetch stuff. So I'd encourage you to kind of read up on JSON server, but hopefully now you have been through and built your own Node APIs, you can kind of realize that all of that you were just doing, that's just handled by JSON server, and it maybe does it a different way to how you would do it, and it's just a prototyping tool. So we've got these. We now want some way to create a new recipe. What I'm going to do, I'm going to new recipe. I'm just going to have a button on there. We're going to new recipe button, and we want to add an event listener. We want to listen for the click on that button, at which point we're going to just send a recipe that we've just like hard coded in here somewhere. So new recipe is going to be title, fish and chips, image. Did I call it? Was it image? Thumbnail. So that's one thing where JSON server is stupid. If I posted an object that had image instead of thumbnail, it would just accept it. It doesn't know that actually we want to follow these rules or whatever. So that's one reason why you don't really want to use JSON server. Okay, so we've got some new recipe object. Let's write our fetch options. We have a method, and it's going to be a post request. We have our headers, and we're going to specify some headers in there in a second. And we have our body. Let's say it's the new recipe. We'll specify the headers, content type is always application JSON. If you're using JSON, obviously, if you're sending XML, if you're sending an audio file, it's the MIME type of whatever data you're sending. Accept is the same thing. One thing to note here, keys or variable names or all sorts of things in JavaScript don't allow hyphens. However, keys, as opposed to variables, can be specified as a string. So it looks a little bit weird to have this inconsistency, but this one must be a string because it has the hyphen in there. So that's our fetch options. Now we can call fetch. We can make a request to the API URL and pass our fetch options. Let's see what happens. we can have a look in the network tab, even before we're logging anything out or whatever. We can see if that request has been successful. If you don't take anything away from this week, which from the levels of interactivity is highly likely, the one thing you want to take away is use the network tab. So before here I was console log and then console log and then recipes is an array of results and blah blah blah. I've just written fetch. I'm just making that request. I hit new recipe and I can already see something's gone wrong. So 400 bad request. We've made a post request to /recipes. We've got a 400 back. So we can look at the preview, unexpected token O in JSON at position 1. Let's see if anyone was paying attention 5 minutes ago. What can we send with our requests? What type of data are we sending? And what are we actually sending?
Oh, we can't send an object, it has to be a string.
Exactly, yeah. So, to convert an object into a string, we call JSON stringify. So I'm sure we covered this before, but let's just do this in the console so we can see it in kind of real time. So we take an object of key value pairs with numbers and booleans and all sorts of things that are sort of workable pieces of data in our code, and we pass that through to JSON stringify, and it gives us a string that represents that object. So that is what we must send, and not just the object itself. If we look in the network tab, you'll see what we did send. Request payload is actually just object. The reason for that is because fetch knows that the body has to be a string. So it takes whatever you give it. So if you give it, I don't know, undefined toString, it's going to call toString, you're going to get an error. If you say an object toString, it gives you a string, but a pretty unhelpful string. So with any object, we're going to call toString on it. You can do the same with a number toString, and that actually is helpful. So if new recipe was just a number, it would actually be fine. We'd be passing a number through to our server. But objects, they must be stringified using JSON.stringify. So now we load the page, we hit new recipe, we can see we have a 201. A 201 means something was created successfully. We can look down at our request payload. This is the body of our request, and we've got thumbnail fish and chips, title fish and chips. This is all stuff we recognize. We look in the preview, and we've got the stuff that we sent plus an ID that JSON server has automatically incremented. So that's something that JSON server does do. It takes whatever JSON you send it and adds an automatic ID. So now I reload the page and fish and chips is now in our database. I can click this a whole bunch of times and we've got loads of fish and chips. So that's a post request. Let's make this a little bit nicer and actually have a form. Anyone Probably Daniel. Anyone want to help me write the form? I'm gonna have this here, input name, just text. Name is title, placeholder is title. What else did we do? Thumbnail. Value. Send new recipe. So we get rid of that button. We get rid of that button. And let's comment the code out for now. What can we do with that form? How do we do that? Anyone? Okay, Daniel, go.
Do we wrap the form in the fetch stuff, or are we going to wrap the fetch stuff?
Yeah, so it's the other way around, so you're kind of on the right lines. And wrap the fetch in the form stuff. What do you mean by the form stuff?
I can see a visual in my head, but explaining it is going to be an absolute mess. So I'm going to just...
So I think if you essentially meant kind of this sort of thing, then you're certainly on the right lines. So first we want to find the form. So recipe form query selector. Let's just get that form. Then we want to do something pretty similar. Recipe form, add event listener, but we want to listen for the submit event. Think back to what we have to do when we submit a form. Maybe, I'm sure we talked about this, but when we submit a form, we don't want the page to reload. We call prevent default. So now it's gonna create a new recipe every time we click send new recipe. I've just done that a bunch of times, and now there's a load more fish and chips. The difference is we want this data to come from the form. Does anyone remember how we can get these elements and the values of these elements out from the form?
To look for the inner text of both input fields.
Almost. We want. So the reason why it isn't inner text, and H1 has inner text, because what inner text is referring to is the text in between the opening and closing tags. But an input field doesn't have a closing tag. It's a self-closing tag. So did you just say value?
Value, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So we want the value. So I'm just going to type some stuff in there. I've clicked on that. I've got $0. That's a Chrome thing. Dot value gives us that string that I've just typed in. Now, how can we get at that element?
We need to find an ID of both the fun URL text box and the name type.
Yes. So let's do that way first. So title input is document query selector. We can actually use the name attribute here name is title. Let me double check that I've got that right. Nope. Input name, I've done that wrong. It's like that, I think. Yeah. So title input is that input field, and we can do the same. For the thumbnail. So title input dot value is nothing. Thumbnail input dot value is nothing, but if we type some stuff in there, then those values are correct. So that's one way to do it. Title input dot value, thumbnail input dot value, and then curry chicken bolty.png. I'm hungry. Reload the page and we've got a chicken bolty in our database. So that actually does work. Let's have a look at our network tab. We've made a post request. It's been created successfully. Look at our payload. We have the value that I just typed in here and the value that I just typed in here. It comes back, ID 29. It's all successfully created in our database. So this is fine, but it's a bit sort of long-winded. If you had quite a big form, you'd have to do all of these things up front, and so what we do have is recipe form.elements, which is a sort of slightly weird object that's kind of like an array but kind of like an object, and it has a key of whatever the names of these input fields are. So recipe form.elements.title is that element. Recipe form.elements.thumbnail is that element. So that you might argue it's sort of longer, but recipe form.elements.title.value. The whole reason that this gives it to you in the element is because it's so often that you want to get access to those input fields through the form, so you don't have to do stuff like this. So recipe form elements thumbnail is the same thing as that thumbnail input, so we don't necessarily need those anymore. We can go through that elements object.
So it knows the name of each element in the form.
Exactly. That's because of this name attribute.
Yeah.
So because you're now building sort of JavaScript driven front ends that use what's in the HTML, you don't have to use this name. You can have some random thing in the ID, and as long as you query select this thing using this ID, then you're fine. But back in the day, before kind of well, we sort of did this with the server-side rendered forms. A form element can actually send data without doing any of this. So if we remove event prevent default and we say carbonara carb.png, whatever, you can see at the top it already constructs kind of an object and makes a request with title equals that value, thumbnail equals that value. So this is just how browsers work and HTML works and all of that. So the names are actually way more important than you kind of realize. So because of that, Chrome has added this elements object which gets dynamically created based on all the names of these fields. Okay, so that's gone through. Create carbonara. We do want to prevent the default. Okay, where are we? Let's look at recipes JSON. All of these have been added. Lots of fish and chips, and finally carbonara. Okay, last step. We want to, currently we have to reload the page. Now we want to create the element on the page after the recipe has been created successfully. So how can we do that? Do we just do it here? So we call fetch and the recipe has been created successfully, and then on here we can do the same thing. Is that correct?
Close enough, yes.
Anyone think otherwise? Anyone think no?
I'll say no as well, so that we have
Good. Good. Okay. So this is optimistic rendering. Now we call fetch here on this line, but this isn't waiting for the fetch to happen. It's not waiting for a response from the server. So we might as well just do it on this line before we bother about communicating with the server at all. However, if we want to verify that the server has accepted our request and successfully created that recipe, we need to use our promise. So we call JSON on the response. We then have our recipe object because the server sends back the recipe that it creates. So we post our recipe that doesn't contain an ID. We get a response, we convert the JSON to JavaScript objects. We then receive that recipe object with the new ID and we create the element successfully. This is now known as pessimistic rendering. So if we were being optimistic and just saying like, yeah, everything's going to work fine, we would just create one as soon as we have the data that we need from the user. But here we're going, well, actually, if this is like a purchase, you don't want to just say like purchase successful when actually we don't know if it's been successful or not. So you want to wait until the server says, yes, that's worked, and only then do we add that to the page. So we can kind of see that in action. We can throttle it to a slow, we can pretend we have a slow internet connection. What did I have last night? Sausage, ragu, PNG. And I'm going to click send new recipe now. We can see it's gone, and then eventually it has appeared on the page. So I'll just do another one, click send recipe, still waiting, and eventually it's there. If we have, okay, my internet's pretty slow right now, but luckily it's all using a local server, so it shouldn't take very long at all. It looks pretty instant, but actually it's taking sort of 6 milliseconds or whatever. So it's up to the product owner, really, if you want to be rendering things optimistically or pessimistically. Generally, I would say pessimistic is best, but I think that's too much of a blanket statement these days. What I think many websites do, they actually are optimistic. So on, I don't know, like Twitter, you click the like button, you tap the like button, and you get a little animation, and they want that action to be satisfying. But if you tap the like button, you have to wait for sort of half a second, and then you get the animation. That won't be satisfying. So I think they aren't waiting to receive a response from the server. They're playing that animation immediately. And maybe if you don't have a connection, if you're going through a tunnel or something on your phone, if you don't have a connection right then, you won't have actually liked that tweet. But I think, I imagine, maybe they'll store it up and they'll send it later on or whatever. But I think it depends on the product and whoever's in charge of the product to determine if you want to be optimistic or pessimistic. Okay, that's post. I'm going to go turn my light on because I can't really see my keyboard, and we're getting into autumn now, which is very sad. Once upon a time, I'd be able to stay up all night coding on a keyboard without backlights. I suppose, are there any questions at this point before we talk about the other types of requests that we can make? Any questions about fetching or post or whatever?
I'm not sure how long it would take, but if we could just quickly just kind of go through what we've done so far and then continue, or we could do it at the end, whichever one.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. Let's go back from the beginning. So, and what time is it? Okay, it's 20 past. So, first we did this. First, we just called fetch with no options. We made a GET request to our recipes URL. That promise resolves when the server sends back a response. So once we do have that response, this function gets called, and we convert the JSON string from the string into an object that we can use. The next, then, we actually have that object. So here we've got recipes, we iterate over the recipes. For each recipe, we display the recipe on the page.
I understand that, but you see, just before we got there, how did it seems like, just looking at the recipes, just came out to me. So I'm looking at the response, I'm looking at how
down here,
wait for the promise, and then all of a sudden I just see recipes next to the then. So I'm wondering, how did we get there, essentially?
Okay.
Everything inside the block makes sense, I get that. But how did we actually, where did recipes come from?
Okay, so if we return an object here that has title, hello, thumbnail, so here we're just going to kind of intercept it. We aren't going to do this, and we're just going to return an array with an object that looks like a recipe. So this is going to work. So we make our request to recipes, but then inside that then we just return an array that contains hello. So inside one of these callbacks, whatever gets returned turns up in the parameter of the next function in the chain of thens. So we can do one more, and param, we can see what param we're getting in here. Now, do you want to have a guess as to what param is going to be? Sorry?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
So it's sort of a trick question, because what does this function return?
The title of the recipe.
Nope. This function with this curly bracket here, this curly bracket here. Do you see the word return anywhere?
No.
Exactly. So this function doesn't actually return anything. In JavaScript, that means it does return something, it returns undefined. So this param is going to be undefined. So this function returns this array. In the next function, we get that as a param. Then the next function receives nothing because that one doesn't receive anything.
Oh yeah.
Then, I don't know, return Sam. Then this one gets a name for some reason. Console log name. So we get undefined, we get Sam. Whatever is returned in each of these appears as a param in the next one.
In the next one. Oh, okay. I got it. Yes.
So this response.json basically returns that object of the data that we got from the server. Now, it actually doesn't. It returns a promise that then actually gets resolved. But what then does is it basically says, okay, what value are you returning from this function? If you're returning a promise, I'm going to wait for that promise and then pass on the value that that promise gives me. If you're just returning anything else, I'm just going to immediately pass it on down the chain. So this one waits for this promise, but inside the next function, it doesn't really matter where it came from. This is from a promise, but really it's just the same as returning an array. So what this is going to look a little bit weird, but maybe I'll write a function. Promise wait is duration Okay, so you don't really need to worry about that, but here we're going to return promise wait 1000, and actually we can have value so promise wait I don't know, Daniel, and then promise wait 500 Mushtaq and so on. So these are now returning promises, whereas this one just returns the value. So if we look in the console, we're going to get immediately undefined and Sam. Oh, that's not what we want. I can't move that. There's like I don't think you can see it, the recording thing. Invalid left-hand side in assignment. Excellent. What have I done wrong? Oh, it's here. Okay, so we saw undefined and Sam immediately. Then it takes sort of a second for Daniel to appear, and then we're not getting mushpack. Oh, because we don't have a console log after that. So if your function just returns a value, you don't really need to have it in a sort of chain of thens or whatever. But I quite like this chain because if you do have a promise and it needs to wait for something, it won't go on to the next function before it gets it. So this recipes object comes from the data in the body of the response being converted from the string into a JavaScript object. Okay, then we've got our form. When we submit our form, we find the value of the input fields, create a JavaScript object, then we set up our fetch options first. So we say what type of request it's going to be. It's going to be a post request. We say the headers, so before the server does something with the body, it looks at the headers and says, can I do something with this? We need to tell it what type of content we're sending, and we need to ask it to accept JSON. It's a bit weird, but you just got to remember all of that. Then we specify the body, and we can only send a string. So we stringify our object, and that all gets sent through with our fetch request. And we do the same thing here, it's just a bit different. We have the shorthand syntax, we don't have curly brackets. So this is returning that promise that gets us the data. So then we have our recipe, and then we display that on the page. This sort of sequence, this and all of these, this is like a lot right now, but it's quite repetitive, so you just have to do it enough and then you will remember it. And really initially you just want to remember it rather than understand it. As soon as you've got to do something different with this function, you always have to slow down and Google it and try to work it out. So a lot of this is just building up kind of muscle memory. Okay, I need to make a post request, so I need method, headers, body. Just write all three of those, then figure out what each one of those is, and then go from there. So it will be a lot to take in now, but don't worry. Luckily, all the other requests that we make are pretty much the same pattern. The only difference here is we are making a patch request instead of a post request. Well, okay, I suppose another difference is the URL. So we're making a request to a particular book. So whereas previously we're making a request just to all recipes, we're posting to all recipes. Now we're patching this one book with the particular book ID. So what we could do is have a recipe URL, but this is actually going to be a function that takes a recipe object and it gives us recipe.id. So recipes/recipe.id. So if we console log recipe URL, log out the recipe URL, we can see that it's generating all of these individual recipe URLs so that we can patch some kind of update to their name or their title or their thumbnail or whatever. So what we can do, what can we do that's kind of quick and easy? So convert to chocolate button. We're going to have a button where the convert to chocolate button in a text says convert to chocolate. Then we append that to our div, convert to chocolate button. So we want to click on these and we want to change the title of that recipe to chocolate in the back end. So we want to keep it. We don't want to delete it and create a new one. We want to keep that recipe at ID 7 or whatever it's going to be, and the title is going to be chocolate. So for that we use a patch request. We want to just patch over something that already exists. We want to update something. That's a patch request. So what we can do, where we're creating these buttons, we can add an event listener and have a function inside here. So when we click on that, we want to make a fetch request to recipe URL, pass it the recipe. So we just saw what it generates. That function is going to generate localhost 2000 /recipe/21 or whatever. Then we're going to do these options a bit differently. We're going to do them in line. So here the method is going to be patch. We need headers and we need a body. Headers first, we can copy this. Content type application JSON, we're still dealing with JSON data, so we need to tell the server that's what we're using and accepting. In the body for a patch request, we only include, you can include everything, but you generally only include the things you want to change. So in this case, we only want to change the title to chocolate. So added our event listener to that button that we just created. We're going to make a request. At the moment we're not doing anything with it, but we can still see it in the network tab. So I'm going to click convert to chocolate, have a look in my network tab. We've made a request to recipes/9. It was a patch request. It says it was okay. Let's look at our payload. This is our body. It's a JavaScript object with a key of title, value of chocolate, and this is the preview of the response. So Chrome knows this is JSON data, so I'm going to let you explore it like a JavaScript object. We can see it has updated successfully with the title chocolate. If I reload the page, whichever one it was, is now going to say chocolate.
That was way easier than I thought.
It is. Once you've got the pattern of kind of fetch and then a URL and then some options, those options generally method headers body, and it's pretty much always the same. That returns a promise. You want to do something after. So again, we're going to be pessimistic. What if the server hasn't updated that? So we're going to wait for the response from the server. The server sends back the updated recipe. So what we can do in here because we've been really lazy, and this is definitely bad practice, to just do it all inside here. The benefit of that is we have access to this div. So each of the divs for all of the recipes, we just have access to it directly. So we can just set div.innerText equals recipe title, this new recipe dot title. So done. Okay, I'm setting inner text. I mean, that's worked out nicely really, but that was unintended. But I'm setting inner text to recipe title, whereas previously we added in a button, but as soon as you set the inner text of an element, it just sets it completely to whatever you've told it to set it to. So we're losing the button because we're setting the inner text. It's kind of good though in this case, because you don't want the convert to chocolate button to be there if you've converted it to chocolate. But anyway, that was a happy accident. So that's pretty straightforward. I think okay, no, we can delete and then I'll refactor, because the code there just looks bad. Put, I can't really be bothered to do put, but if we were to do this, so let's pretend this is a recipe and this is a title. Put replaces what's there, so it still keeps something at that ID, but here we're sending an object with only the title, which is exactly the same as what we were sending with our patch request. But with a put request, it will get rid of the thumbnail URL. It will just have a title. It won't have a thumbnail. Whereas with a patch, it goes, okay, you want to update the title, but I'll leave everything as it is.
Alright, cool. So that was going to be my next question. What essentially is the difference?
Exactly, yeah, that's the difference. And really, that's the difference if your API is following RESTful conventions. Actually, like all of this isn't automated. You guys have just been building your own servers. You know that someone is there going, okay, server dot or app, whatever it is, app dot put or app.patch, and so you decide what actually happens with a put request or a patch request. It's just generally the kind of conventions are put replaces, patch updates. So we can kind of ignore that, and I want to get to delete because that is even easier. With a delete request, we're not sending any data. We're just sending the fact that it is a delete request. So we just have to change the method. We don't include a body, and because we don't include a body, we don't have to include any headers that describe what the body is. So a delete request is even easier. We just include the method delete. So again, let's chuck a delete button. Delete button document query. No, what am I doing? Create element button. Text is X. Delete button dot style dot background. Red, and append it to the div.append, delete button. Then we add our click listener, and we want to make a fetch request to the recipe URL using that function that we wrote at the top. We pass it that recipe. We pass it the fact that it's a delete request, and now we've got all those buttons. We can start deleting some of these duplicated fish and chips. 1, 2, 3, 4. Look in the network tab. I've made requests to 4, 5, 6 and 7. We can see it was okay, so everything was deleted successfully. There's no body down here, there's nothing special in the headers. Reload the page and we've got fewer fish and chips than we had before. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see the networked requests. So that's pretty nice. If we want to wait, in this case, we're not really doing anything with the updated data because the thing is deleted. So here, we don't really need to do this response JSON, blah, 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 because you don't actually use it. So right now, and even this is a massive simplification of what you would really do, because we're not checking that the request actually, the response was okay. We're not checking that it's saying success, everything worked. So it's a simplification, but we're still going to wait for a response from the server, and we're going to say div.remove. That's all we need to do to delete those elements. So if I put it on slow 3G, I click now, and it takes sort of several seconds for it to actually delete. So that is kind of a sort of benefit or whatever, it's a choice to pessimistically update the page. Okay, now I want to refactor. I don't like this. All of this code that is dealing with displaying recipes, dealing with updating recipes and deleting recipes, it's all like inside a callback of the promise that's returned from this initial fetch call. That's really very messy. The problem with refactoring it out into separate functions is it kind of makes it, at least when you're kind of starting to learn this, it does seem to make it a bit more confusing. Some people always get a bit stubborn and say like, oh, I like it like this because it's easy to understand, and because you just have that div there and it's very easy and whatever. But it's just really ugly. You don't want anything like this in here. You certainly don't want fetch requests inside all your other code like this. So what we're going to do, I'm going to have a copy of this pre-factor before the refactor, and I'm actually going to have a separate API file. So this API URL, the recipe URL, they both go in the API file. This recipes.js is going to only really deal with kind of displaying the recipes. It doesn't really need to know what the URL of the API we're using is, how it constructs recipe URLs or anything like that. So we're going to move those over into the API file. We're going to take all of this stuff and we're going to write a, what is that? That's post recipe. So we're going to post a recipe. We create fetch options, we receive new recipe, then we want to return fetch. So, oh, something's gone wrong. What's happened here? Why am I not formatting anymore? I don't like it.
Anyway, got frozen on screen.
Oh, right. That's interesting. Let's stop and start again, shall we? Oh, it doesn't like this. Sorry, an error occurred when screen sharing. Well, that's a shame. Stop sharing. It doesn't want to do it. God, don't you just love Windows? How else can we do it? I mean, I can set up a live share. Oh, I don't know. I think I might just give up. I will. Even the button to present is greyed out now. What's happening? I'll reload the page. I've left the meeting. Okay, let's see. Oh, okay. Can you see?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I can't format, which is annoying. I don't really understand what's going on here. But, so I've moved this code into a function called post recipe. So that's going to be in a separate API file. Now, one thing I like to do with this sort of thing, just to be really clear about what's happening, just create an API object with a property called post recipe. That is also the value of post recipe. And then over here, inside the place where we're dealing with the form and the HTML page and whatever, then we can call API.postRecipe, pass it the new recipe, and over here it deals with all of the method and the headers and the stringify and all of that stuff. It even converts the response to JSON for us. So in our code that is to do with displaying stuff, we say really explicitly API.postRecipe, we pass it the new recipe, and then we just get that recipe back. We don't bother with headers or the fetch or response. Like I don't like seeing fetch in and around other code like this. Obviously we need to include it here. Okay, so we do the same thing for this. This one actually could be something called get all recipes, just again to be really, really explicit. So get all recipes, and we don't even need the curly brackets on the first function. That's all it does. That's all that function does, but it just simplifies this code a little bit. Get all recipes, then I've got the recipes. I'm not even doing anything with that response. So here is where it gets a bit interesting. So we're going to have display recipes, takes in an array of recipes, and actually all of that, display recipes, you just want to be really descriptive as much as possible. So now, okay, all of these things that are still in there, we don't actually need them. This just says get all recipes, then display recipes. Fine. Because maybe in reality it probably does 5 things, and this should just read nicely. Display recipes, set up login info, blah, 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 blah. That should just be really descriptive about what's actually happening. Ooh, something's going very strange. So inside display recipes, all I want that to do is iterate over my array of recipes and call another function, display recipe singular. So here we take a single recipe and we do all of this, display recipe singular, and we've got, I'm going to restart VS Code as well. I'm just going to restart everything. Format please. Okay, great. So we now have one function. It's still big, but this flow is a bit more easy to understand. Get recipes, then display recipes. Display recipes, okay, takes an array of recipes and calls display recipe for each individual recipe. So we create the recipe element, that's fine, that can stay in here. The fetch, and then that certainly can go over into API. Let's say API dot patch recipe. We want to pass the recipe we're going to patch and the new data that we want to update. So we want to patch this recipe to include this new data. So let's go over here, let's create that. Patch recipe is like current recipe and new recipe data. So fetch to recipe URL with this recipe, and then the new recipe data, instead of this hard-coded chocolate, we are creating a function that's going to be much more flexible, and so we just pass it whatever object we receive from patch recipe. So we want to return that, convert the response to JSON, we want to include that in our object, and now API.patch recipe is going to work. We can do the same for delete. API.delete recipe. And we might as well, for consistency, let's convert the response and include that in our API object. Now, for me, this is still kind of doing quite a lot, but it's way more easy to understand than it was previously. When we're in this part of the code, when we're worrying about what elements are going on the page, we don't need to see all of that patch config object with the headers and all of that stuff. So this makes for much more readable code. Yeah, I mean I think that would do. It's yeah, API post recipe. Yeah, I think that's about as refactored as I want to take it for now. Okay, 55. Sorry, even though we really started 20 minutes late, we're not going 20 minutes late. So any questions now about all these different methods and kind of the various things we can do with fetch and making requests and promises and things.
So when you upload this, like all of this code that you've done?
Yes, yeah. The code from the other day is up already. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that now. Yeah. And we have it before the refactor as well, just because people find that they're more kind of familiar with that because we built it up over time. So I've included that as well. So that should all be there. Cool. Okay. Thanks very much, everyone.
Cheers, man.
See ya. Bye.